We are approaching the anniversary of Barbarossa, the German-led invasion of Russia, on June 22, 1941. The Red Army at the time had some 5.5 million mobilized troops and a reserve of 14 million more. Were somewhat aware of a German buildup on their borders, but they were constrained by Stalin's belief that Germany would not attack due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact from 1939, where they teamed up against Poland. You all know this. Marshal Timoshenko and General Georgy Zhukov was initially cautious and set up defensive measures. This week would see troop redeployments, fortification efforts, and a limited number of minefield adjustments. Stalin's orders were to avoid provocation. That's what we have been told ever since. And Germany this week, they were in the final stages of assembling the largest invasion force in history. Approximately 3.2 million German troops and 690,000 Axis allies from Romania, Finland, Hungary, Italy, Croatia, and Slovakia. The Wehrmacht was about to execute a three-pronged blitzkrieg under the codename Operation Barbarossa. That is what we have always been told, and that is what appeared to have happened. But is that really the entire story? Now, from the German point of view, that is exactly what they did. And they certainly gave it a good swing, going after the Russian armed forces in the opening of the battle, destroying what we have been told was completely outdated Russian army equipment, all unprepared, outdated tanks, and a Red Air Force flying biplanes, all outdated. And yes, the Axis did destroy an ungodly amount of Russian tanks and planes in the opening weeks of Barbarossa. They also captured huge stocks of fuel, munition, guns, tanks, etc. They, in fact, destroyed more Russian planes than almost all other militaries in the world had at the time combined. They also destroyed more Russian tanks than all other countries in the world had combined as well. Now, does that not strike you as a little odd? We have been told of this completely outdated, unmodernized Russian military, yet they still had more armor and planes to lose than everybody else. And why were they bundled up right next to the border with Germany? In fact, one of the Red Army Air Force airfields was 700 meters from the demarcation line. And why were all this hardware sitting right on the border? Why had Stalin halted construction of the Stalin Line bunkers long before? And what had Stalin's military learned from the battles at Khankin Gol or the war with Finland? Over the recent years, much research, new research, and documents have finally come to light, and it paints a very different story of what was actually happening on the ground. For years, Stalin had prepared for a war against the West. His military was not backwoods by any means. There were over 1,000 T-34s on the Western Front, a tank which was far better and more modern than anything else anybody else had at that time. Stalin had the first amphibious tank, incidentally also the only one because no other militaries had one. He had super heavy self-propelled guns and a lot of modern ground attack planes. Stalin was preparing for a war of fast-paced aggression. And according to Pravda, he also had 2 million airborne troops. That is hardly something that can be seen as a defensive tool. Stalin had his troops placed roughly across the frontier from where the Germans had theirs placed. So what happened there? That's simple. Hitler simply beat him to it by a few weeks. Hitler's army was well versed in fast-paced wars, and Stalin's army and air force was in place for the same. They were not in place to defend, but to attack. And that is why the materials, thousands of trains full of munitions and fuel, was right up near the frontier. Russian soldiers were now clearing advance routes through their own minefields. They were not ready for battle yet, and almost none of the T-34s had even been calibrated, and the crews had not been finally trained on them. The troops were still en route to their jump-off points. That is why Stalin was so keen to not let anybody on his side trigger the battle and provoke the Germans an early strike. He wasn't ready. And when the Germans came, his soldiers were not in position yet, and they were destroyed in assembly points or on transports, as we've seen. Now, over the next month, I will build this case along with experts in their field. Chieftain will come on and talk about Russian armor, and Rex from Rex's Hangar will come on and talk about the Red Air Force. And I will take you through the events from Kangin-Gol to Finland to Poland to Barbarossa to the part where FDR handed Stalin billions of dollars of equipment, including all Americans' military secrets and patents, preparing Stalin well for the Cold War, while selling his ally Britain down the river, along with Poland and the rest of the Eastern European countries, which will end up dominated by the Russians for the next following 4 decades. We are going to have to clean up history and events again, and I will build you that case in detail. Let's take a look at the events and activities on both sides of this week 84 years ago. Now, the Germans were moving equipment and troops. By June 15th, 680,000 German troops were already concentrated in assembly areas along the Romanian-Soviet border, with additional forces moving from Poland, East Prussia, and other territories. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had the 16th Army and the 18th Army, and Panzergruppe 4, with 570 tanks under him. They moved assault infantry and engineers are moving towards the Soviet border in East Prussia and Lithuania by night to avoid detection. By June 19th, the 41st Motorized Corps and the 39th Motorized Corps were in position near the Lithuanian border, prepared to advance towards Leningrad. Sneaking through East Prussia, German soldiers mentioned hearing the frogs croaking in the marshy areas of East Prussia, breaking the silence as they were moving on June 21st. Imagine having your advance route being given up by speaky frogs. Army Group Center, under command of General Fedor von Bock. Under him he had the 4th Army, the 9th Army, the 2nd Panzergruppe under Heinz Guderian, and the 3rd Panzergruppe under General Hermann Hoth, 1,700 tanks. On June 7th, the 2nd and 3rd Panzergruppe was assembling near Brest-Litovsk and outside Warsaw. Combined, they had 3,400 tanks totally across the front. Most of the infantry had 3.7 cm tank guns, and also some 5 cm, and a few trucks with 88s for anti-tank defense as well. These were all positioned behind the Panzer spearheads. Guderian's forces moved 200 kilometers eastwards from Poland, all camouflaging their tanks in forests to avoid Soviet reconnaissance. A German infantry noted the eerie quiet of Polish forests, with only the clank of tank tracks and whispering of orders as the units were staging near the Buk River. Army Group South, under General Gerd von Rundstedt. Under him he had the 6th Army, 17th Army, and the 1st Panzergruppe under General Paul Ludwig von Kleist. By June 18th, 650,000 Romanian and German troops were massing in southern Poland and Romania. They were headed for Kiev and the Black Sea coast. The 11th Army, with Romanian units, staged near the Prut River, while Kleist's panzers moved to forward positions in Galicia. The Romanian soldiers were eager to reclaim Bessarabia, were seen polishing their bayonets and sharing cigarettes with German troops, while all mocking their own outdated equipment. At this point, 600,000 motor vehicles and 625,000 horses had been mobilized, with supply depots established in Poland, Romania, and narrow-gauge railroads transported 7,000 artillery pieces and ammunition to forward bases. Meanwhile, the activities on the Russian sides were on the Western Military District. By June 15th, 11,000 of 23,000 tanks, including 14,700 combat-ready, mostly T-26 and BT-7 tanks, were positioned in the Western District facing Germany. These were fast tanks in order to assault with the infantry. They also had 33,000 artillery pieces, which were deployed, outnumbering the German artillery by far. Hardly a shabby setup. The Kiev Special Military District On June 16th, Zhukov, under Timoshenko's orders, secretly directed the deployment of additional forces close to the border, including the 5th Army and 6th Army, to strengthen defenses near Lvov and the Bug River. These movements were concealed to avoid German detection. By June 18th, the 4th and 15th Mechanized Corps, with T-34s and KV-1 tanks, were repositioned 50 to 100 kilometers from the border, but units remained dispersed due to poor transportation. Soviet tank crewmen near Lvov struggled to move his T-34 tank through the muddy terrain in the dark, with the drivers cursing the lack of spare parts, unaware of what was imminent. In the Western Special Military District, under General Dmitriev Pavlov, the 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies were spread out across Belarus, with forward units in Grodno and Brest. By June 20th, rifle divisions were ordered to occupy forward trenches, but only 30 to 40% were in positions due to logistical delays. Red Army private near Brest recalled digging trenches under moonlight, ordered to work silently to avoid alerting German scouts. Baltic Special Military District, the 8th and 11th Armies were moving towards Lithuania, with the 41st Rifle Corps reinforcing positions near the Kaunas by 18 June. However, units lacked adequate fuel and ammunition. That was the stage of the forces in overall. So let's go for a short day-to-day breakdown from June 15th. The German Army Group Center Panzergruppe 2 under Guderian moved tanks to the forest near Brest-Litovsk, camouflaged with the branches. Luftwaffe intensifies reconnaissance over Soviet airfields. In Russia, Zhukov orders secret redeployment of the 5th Army to the Kiev district's border. Stalin reviews intelligence but insists on diplomacy to delay German attacks. On June 16th, the German Army Group South 11th Army stages in Romania, with Romanian units drilling for joint operations. Brandenburg commandos trained for infiltration missions. In Russia, sappers begin marking minefield lanes near Lvov. Under strict orders to avoid detection, rifle divisions in Belarus start occupying trenches. On June 17th, German Army Group North assault engineers move to East Prussia, preparing to clear Soviet minefields. Luftwaffe maps show Soviet defenses in Lithuania. On the Russian side, Soviet intelligence reports 12 German panzer divisions. Timoshenko requests high alert, but Stalin limits the actions to readiness without provocation. On June 18th, German Panzergruppe 1 under Kleist positions his tanks in Galicia. Ukrainian Nightingale units cross the border to sabotage and conduct reconnaissance. In Russia, the 41st Rifle Corps reinforces Kaunas positions. Airfields begin dispersing aircraft, but only 10 to 15 are actually moved by June 21st. June 19th, German Brandenburger commandos infiltrate Soviet lines near Brest and the Niemen River, sabotaging phone lines. An Army Group Center finalizes the artillery targeting. The Soviet Russians at the Stalin Line fortifications are seen to rush constructions. Zhukov inspects the Kiev district, frustrated by the slow troop movements. On June 20th, Germany's final supply deliveries reach the forward depots. Hitler briefs the OKH on invasion goals. The Brandenburg unit seize a bridge near Grodno, disguised as Soviets. In Soviet Russia, Stalin receives Sorg's warnings but dismisses them. Border guards report German activity but are ordered not to engage. On June 21st, the German code word Düsseldorf issued to the German Army Group North at 1300 hours, followed by Dortmund to other units. Assault troops move to the jumping-off points under darkness. In Soviet Russia, Red Army units receive vague, be-ready orders. Sappers complete limited minefield lanes near Lvov, and Stalin retires to his dacha, unconvinced of an attack. And the next day, the battle was on. A battle many have since questioned, citing the war was lost for the Germans the day Hitler invaded Russia, a vast country with enormous resources and with American help. But I will begin to make it for you the case that he had little choice. For a decade, Stalin had traded, worked, killed, and forced Russia into a modern country, with a huge military, with the express plan to spread communism by force to the rest of the world, as Lenin would always say. The goal of the revolution is to spread to the rest of the world. as they indeed tried to spread it in 1920, but were stopped by the Polish army, with some international volunteers, I might say. Stalin took stock of that and began to make long-term plans, and the lesser-known war against Japan in Manchuria was quite a logistical feat at the time. With Zhukov in charge eventually, the Russians were learning about logistics and aggressive war. And Finland, a war many said Russia lost due to the mere losses in numbers. But that is looking at Russia the wrong way. Losses are not important to Russia. Results are. And in midwinter, covered in ice and snow, the Russians charged a fortified Finnish line again and again, thousands of tanks and planes, and kept going, ignoring the losses, and eventually got roughly what they wanted by mere attrition, only stopped because Western opinion was going against them. Now, I ask you this. What army in 1940 could have massed 2,500 tanks, 1,000,000 soldiers, and 3,000 planes for a winter attack near the Arctic Circle? None. No other military in the world could have done this at that time. So the claim that Russia were an outdated military the following year seems a little less credible, doesn't it? And why was it completely forgotten to history that basically from 1941, June 1923, that Russia had previously invaded 7 sovereign nations and invaded Poland with Germany as an ally? It was certainly forgotten at the Nuremberg trials, just like the 30,000 Polish soldiers and officers whom were killed by the Russians after. That was all forgotten, conveniently. And despite Stalin being a ruthless dictator of a communist dictatorship, having killed millions of people, starved a quarter of Ukraine's population to death, deliberately and murdered his own by slave labor, harvesting gold and grain to trade for American and German machinery and equipment and know-how. Despite this, FDR still embraced Stalin and furnished him with billions of lend-lease which was never to be paid. Nor did FDR want anything in return, despite him charging his ally Britain an exuberant sum for what they were given, the same equipment. But why? FDR would give the Russians everything they wanted and more, and never even demanded the Russians release American aircrews imprisoned by them, all playing into Stalin's plan. Now, there is a lot to unpack there, and I will do that for you over the next month, along with the experts, as we follow Russia's learning curve and their military buildup and the truth of the Lend-Lease. So strap in. This is going to get a little messy to clean up history here, because what a mess it is. I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.